Changing your shock seal out can be intimidating, but it's actually not that hard to do. We're going to walk you through the process step by step. Now these shocks, they have a floating piston in them, and they can be difficult to bleed up and fill with nitrogen unless you have special tools or a bladder conversion kit. Now we do have a video that shows you how to install one of those bladder conversion kits, but not everybody wants to do that. So if you want to keep the stock reservoir with that floating piston, luckily Racetech makes this special screw that can be used with a nitrogen needle, and that way you can rebuild this shock at home. Now again, this is the XACT shock from WP. These came out in 2020, and all it is an updated linkage style shock from WP. And this one came off a 2020 FC450. Basically, if you have a reservoir that looks like this and a bleeder screw on top, then the process will be similar for you. Just make sure you reference your model specific service manual throughout the process. For parts, we have our Racetech suspension fluid, a Tusk seal head, that's going to come with the retaining clip. We have our nitrogen bolt and our nitrogen needle. Those are both going to be from Racetech. We have some red Loctite, seal grease, and some suspension cleaner. To do this job, we're going to use some safety glasses, rubber gloves, rags. The two tools you can't do the job without are the seal head setting tool and the seal bullet. Now, other things that are nice to have would be this Tusk shock spanner wrench. This is going to keep you from damaging that plastic collar on the shock. Or you could use the Tusk spring compressor, one of the two. Now, we're also going to use the Racetech shock clip removal tool and a depth gauge. If you don't have a depth gauge, alternatively, you could use a digital caliper and just use that sliding end that comes out. Now, one more thing, not all socket sets have a 24mm socket, so make sure you have one of those as well. The first thing you need to do is remove your shock from the bike, and if you need to know how to do that, refer to your model specific service manual. Once you've done that, you want to clean the shock up, make sure it's not dirty, and we need to count the clickers and back them out all the way. So to do that, what we're going to do is take a flat blade screwdriver. I'm going to start with the rebound, and I'm going to turn this one click at a time and count each click until it lightly bottoms out. We're going clockwise. So we've got 16 clicks on that. I'm going to write it down before I forget. And then we need to back this screw out all the way counterclockwise. And then we're going to do the same thing on the low speed compression adjuster. And we're 15 out on the compression. And then we need to count the turns on this high speed compression adjuster. To do that, this thing's going to be different. It's not going to be clicks, it's just going to be full turns. So I'm just using a breaker bar so it's easy to tell, but I'm just going to watch the handle and see how many turns it goes in. So that was just over 2 turns out. So I'm going to back it out all the way counterclockwise now. Write that down. Then at this point, we're going to install the shock into our vise. We have the Racetech vise jaws that are made for suspension. These are really handy to have, but at a minimum, I recommend just having soft jaws. If you have to, you can use some rags or wooden blocks to hold this in there. So at this point, we need to remove our spring. To do that, you've got a couple options. So if you want, you can loosen this Allen screw, and you have this plastic adjuster. You can use one of these Tusk shock spanner wrenches to back that off. It's going to take the tension off the spring, but I don't want to have to readjust the preload. So I'm just going to use a couple of Tusk spring compressors. So all we need to do is compress the spring far enough to expose this retaining clip. So I'm just going to use our clip removal tool, pop this clip off. As we take everything off, you want to make sure you lay it out in order. That way you can get it all reassembled correctly. And we have this retainer and a washer. And then we can remove this spring. Now I've removed the shock from the vise, and I'm going to press down on the shaft. And we just want to check the action of this shock. Now, if your shock is in good condition, that's exactly what it's going to look like. If it looks any different going in or out, then you know you have some issues, or can verify that you have issues. But obviously the most common reason you'd be in here is because of a leaky shock shaft seal, and that's real simple to diagnose. So we're going to continue with disassembly. Now with the shock back in the vise, make sure you're wearing safety glasses, and we're going to loosen up the screw on the bottom of the reservoir. Don't completely remove it yet. We just want to let that nitrogen slowly leak out. Now we can remove the bolt and O-ring. We'll set those aside. Now this step you don't have to do, but I recommend doing this to make sure you get everything back together correctly. So we've got our depth gauge. I'm going to slide that O-ring up. We'll slide this all the way down against that piston in the reservoir. We've got the shock shaft extended all the way up. We'll press down this O-ring. That's going to tell us how far that piston is in there. When we take it out, ours is actually at 95 millimeters. So that way we know when we reassemble everything, if we don't have the same measurement, then something's wrong inside of there. You need to go back in and figure out what's going on. But once you have that figured out, what we need to do is remove this shock shaft. So what we're going to do is pop up this cap. Now to remove this cap, you can either use a punch on these holes, but it's probably going to mark it up a little bit, or you can use a wood chisel or just a chisel that's been sharpened enough that it's really skinny on the end. That's going to help avoid scratching this anodized surface. Once that's loose, I'm going to use a zip tie to get that cap out of my way. And you can see there's actually some dirt down by the seal head. We want to get all that out of there and clean it up. So I'm going to spray it with suspension cleaner. Now we're going to take the Racetech seal head setting tool. We're going to press this down until we have that circlip or the snap ring exposed. If you don't have one of these tools, you can use a small screwdriver and a pick. Now one more thing, while we're right here, you want to make sure that there's no damage to the shock body, or that we didn't scratch it with that snap ring, because that could damage that piston or the piston ring when we pull this out. If you did, or if there's any scratches, you want to get some fine emery cloth and clean that up. And then again, we're going to spray out any remaining dirt in here, just because we don't want to get dirt on any of the internal parts. So I'm just going to loosen this bleeder screw on top. Obviously I've flipped the shock over. So with that bolt out, I'm just going to drain all the fluid that's in here into the drain pan. You might actually have to press down on the shock shaft to get it out. And we should be able to just pull up on this and remove the shock shaft. And there we go. We're going to make a little bit of a mess here, but there's not much we can do about it. So I'm going to go ahead, set the shock shaft out, and then I'll remove this body from the vise and dump the rest of the oil out. Now we're going to remove this compression adjuster. This is a 24 millimeter socket. And we're going to remove that spring and piston. Now we've removed the shock body from the vise, and if you had really dark oil, you can flush this out with some new suspension oil or use suspension clean. Just keep in mind there's an O-ring on this piston in here, so that's why I recommend just flushing it out with fresh oil. And then you're going to want to inspect this for any cracks down in there or visible damage. If you see any damage, definitely get it replaced. Ours is looking pretty good. Now moving on, we're going to inspect the shock shaft. Now with this, the piston ring, if it has a copper color to it, then this thing is worn out. Now you can see this one's kind of brown, but if it's a lighter copper color, then that's when you're going to be needing to replace this piston. So at this point we can go ahead and remove the nut that is on top. And at this point I'm just going to take this clip pick, and we have a ton of little shims on this piston on both sides. We don't want to get those mixed up. So to keep everything in order, I'm just pressing on this whole stack and the spacer, and we're going to keep all of that together. Then we've got our seal head. Take that off, the zip tie, and our cap. And then this bumper, if this thing is damaged or if the bike is several years old, then you want to get this replaced. The next thing we need to do is inspect the shock shaft. So the main thing we're looking for is any damage to this chrome coating, whether it be worn through or any chips or nicks, and just make sure it's not bent. Once you've done that, you can remove it from the vise, and we're going to spray off all of these parts with suspension cleaner. Now you want to remove the spring from the old seal head. We've already cleaned ours off. Then on the new seal head, get some grease, some seal grease, and apply it to the seals and bushings on the head. Then you can install this new spring onto it. And then now that we have that done, what we're going to do, we've got this cap, slide that down into place. Then you're going to want to take your seal bullet. This one is the M18 by 12. This one's available from Tusk. We're going to lube the shaft up a little bit and that bullet. Now we can slide the seal head into place, and all the bullet does is make sure we don't cut the lip of our new seal on the shock shaft. Remove the bullet, and now we have this big spacer, the compression shim stack, our piston, and then the rebound shim stack with a washer on top. Now these shim stacks, they're not going to be lined up perfect once they're off. So you might have to move the shims back and forth as you put these on. Just be really careful, make sure that you keep all these in order. And since we're using Loctite, I want to make sure that these threads on top are clean. All right, so at this point you want to apply a little bit of red Loctite to that nut. And then we're going to torque this nut to 29.5 foot-pounds. Now after you have it torqued, you can wipe any excess Loctite from the top. You could even spray a little bit of contact cleaner on there and spray that into your pan. Now one thing I want to point out with the shims as you go back together, if you see any shims that aren't laying flush one on another, then you want to find out what the problem is and get it fixed. All these should be stacked up kind of in a pyramid, and they're all going to be flush with each other. Now we can apply grease to the compression adjuster O-rings. We'll install this assembly and torque it to 25.8 foot-pounds. At this point, we're going to remove the shock body from the vise, and we have that floating piston inside of here, inside this reservoir. So all I'm going to do, I'm going to take this depth gauge. You could use a screwdriver if you had to, and we're just going to press this piston down as far as we can without forcing anything or breaking anything. And what we need to do at this point is we're going to use a syringe and fill this reservoir up with our shock fluid. So I'm going to take the syringe, I'm going to fill this up with as much fluid as I can, and we're going to fill up this reservoir on the shock. All right, so we've got this topped off. We're just going to let it sit here for a couple minutes, let all the air bubbles come to the top. Once you let it sit for a minute, you can install this bleeder bolt. And then to get the air bled out of the system, one of the things we're going to do is press up on that piston with our depth gauge, and we're going to push that fluid through this compression stack. That's going to bleed the air out of it. And then we're going to fill this shock body most of the way full with shock oil. So we've got that oil about, an inch to half an inch from the top. And then what we need to do is make sure this piston is in the correct spot. So just make sure it's all the way bottomed out in here. And then at this point you can actually take a measurement. So I'm going to double check this. So we're at 97 millimeters is the depth of our piston right now. And we'll take a measurement in a couple steps just to make sure we did everything right. With our reservoir filled up, we're going to take our special bolt and install the O-ring onto it. Then this is also going to have a washer. That's just going to keep you from smashing that O-ring all the way. Now, one thing I do want to point out with these bolts before I set this into place is, these ends where they're kind of tapered, if you're having a hard time getting it started, you can run a tap down this. It's going to be an M5 by 0.8 thread pitch. And you want to take care of that before you screw it into the bladder. So I'm going to go ahead and get this started. So we've got that snug down. And at this point, we need to take the nitrogen needle. Now we're going to go ahead and pump this up to 40 PSI. All right, so I've gone ahead and applied some shock oil to this piston ring. You want to apply shock oil or grease to this O-ring as well. And then we need to bleed the system up. Keep in mind, this rebound clicker, it's going to be on the same side as the compression clicker. We can go ahead and install this. You might make a little bit of a mess, but that's okay. And then the whole goal here is to get all the air out of the system. So what we're going to do is pump this shock shaft up and down until we don't see any more air coming out. And it can be helpful to push it down quick a couple times. That opens the shim stack, and it's going to help the bubbles come to the top. Now, one thing you want to pay attention to is make sure that these bleed holes are fully submerged in oil at all times once you start the bleeding process. Once you have those bubbles bled out, we're going to let this sit for 5 or 10 minutes and let any remaining bubbles in the fluid work to the top. The whole reason the dealerships have that special tool to bleed the system is you don't want any air in here at all. So that's why we're going to let this sit for a few minutes, then maybe pump it one more time, make sure you have no bubbles, and then we can proceed with reassembly. I do want to point out that using the KTM vacuum bleeder tool is the best way to bleed your shock and make sure you get all the air out of the system. But the method we're showing you is the next best option if you don't have access to one of these special tools. Now we can pull the shock shaft up as high as you can. Make sure those two little holes are still under the shock fluid. But we're going to top this off. This is where it's going to get a little messy. We don't want any air in there. So I'm going all the way to the top. We're going to press down on the seal head and put this into place. So now we're going to take the seal head setting tool. This is where you're going to be making a mess. But you're going to press this all the way down until that O-ring seals everything off. All right, so obviously we're hydro locked at this point. You want to make sure the shock shaft is all the way up. To get this seal head the rest of the way down, we're going to have to release the pressure from this cartridge. So I'm going to do that at the same time as I press down on the seal head. And we can remove that seal head setting tool and install our new retaining clip. Now make sure this clip is fully seated. If it's not, the shock is going to come apart on you. Now at this point we can go ahead and pull up on the shock shaft, pull it up all the way, make sure the seal head seats. Then we can clean up the seal head with a rag, and we're going to install the cap. Now before you hit the cap into place, I always like to have these holes lined up with the shock eyelet, and that way one of these holes is going to be at the lowest point when this is mounted up on the bike. If any water gets in there, it's going to drain out easy. I'm going to press down on the Schrader valve on that nitrogen filling needle, and I'm going to press the shock shaft down. So at this point we're ready to fill the shock with nitrogen. Now one thing, if you did use your depth gauge, you can verify that everything was done correctly by removing this bolt. But if you do that, you need to make sure this shock shaft is fully extended. Press your piston all the way down and take your measurement. So the piston, from its fully seated position to where it is now with the seal head installed, it raised 7 millimeters. So typically, if you do it the style we did, it's going to raise 6 to 8 millimeters. If you used a vacuum bleeder, it's going to raise 3 to 5. So if you're in that range, then you can proceed and fill this shock with nitrogen. Since most of you guys aren't going to have a nitrogen tank to fill your shock up, you can usually take it to your local shop and get the shock charged with nitrogen for a small fee. All right, so now we're filled with nitrogen. We're going to check the action of the shock, and I'm just going to press down. and then make sure it extends all the way on its own, and then it comes out smooth. If it speeds up at any points, that means you've got some air still in the system. Ours is working good. So now we can go ahead and put the spring back on, and we've got our washer, spring retainer, and we have the retaining clip. And if you didn't use the spring compressors, then just make sure you get this adjuster back to its original location. Now, if you guys need any parts for your shock rebuild, be sure to get those on our website. For now, we're just going to set our compression and rebound adjusters back to their original positions. And that's all there is to rebuilding your WP XACT shock. As long as you have the right tools and parts, it's really not that bad of a job to do. And if you want to see more helpful content like this, subscribe to our channel. We also have a video on how to rebuild the front fork. So go check that out. Thanks for watching.